Greetings everyone. Welcome to Gurukul CEC lectures. I'm Mehak Chawla, art educator, Bharatnatyam dancer and disciple of Guru Srimati Geeta Chandranji. Having previously discussed protoforms of Yakshagana, early Kodiyatam and martial dance traditions, we now progress to the study of mask and animal spirit dances. So, various regions practiced animal mask dances where performers embodied forest spirits, animals or mythic beings. These forms served ritualistic, protective and festive functions while representing a worldwide closed worldview closely tied to nature and animistic belief systems. Now let's study about the processional and festival dances. Seasonal festivals, harvest rituals and processions included collective singing and dancing, forming a living performance culture that contributed vocally, musically and rhythmically to the broader aesthetic landscape. As this socio-cultural landscape evolved from the later Vedic period onward, artistic practices, especially dance, continued to absorb philosophical, ritualistic and aesthetic influences that shaped their pedagogy and purpose. This gradual refinement of technique, expression and training methods reflects not only historical continuity but also the adaptive nature of Indian dance. Understanding this developmental trajectory allows us to contextualize contemporary pedagogy within its rich cultural lineage and evaluate its impact on a dancer's physical, emotional and social intelligence. Having understood how processional and festival dances rooted in seasonal rhythms, agricultural cycles and community celebrations formed an essential part of early Indian performance culture, we can now appreciate how these living traditions shaped the broader aesthetic sensibilities of the time. As we trace the gradual evolution of artistic practices from the later Vedic age onward, it became evident that dance and music were not isolated art forms but deeply intertwined with emerging religious philosophies, ritual structures and evolving modes of community expression. This steady refinement of technique, narrative expression and training methods reflect the inherent adaptability of Indian artistic traditions, preparing the ground for more organized and codified cultural developments. It is at this crucial juncture when local, oral and ritualistic forms were becoming increasingly systematized that we transition into a new chapter of Indian cultural history, the Maurya and Shunga periods. In this next stage, we witness a significant transformation driven not only by philosophical movements such as Buddhism and Jainism, but also by the rise of large imperial states that actively shaped artistic production. Thus, moving from community-led festivals and ritual dances into the era of the Mauryan Empire, we shift from folk-based performative creativity to state-sponsored monumental art, narrative sculpture and early aesthetic codification, developments that would profoundly influence the foundation of classical Indian dance and drama. Now let's study about the introduction of the Mauryan cultural landscape. The Mauryan period marks a decisive turning point in the cultural and artistic history of the Indian subcontinent, emerging after the diverse regional cultures of the Mahajanapadas and the philosophical richness introduced by Buddhism and Jainism. The Mauryan Empire represents the first moment of large scale political unification under a centralized authority, with Chandragupta Maurya establishing a vast empire and Emperor Ashoka shaping its moral and cultural ethos. The period witnessed unprecedented state involvement in artistic production. Under Ashoka's patronage, Buddhism expanded widely, resulting in the construction of monumental stupas, polished stone pillars, and symbolic artworks that communicated ethical and spiritual ideals across regions. This era saw a gradual shift of community based oral and ritual performance practices to more structured, ideologically guided artistic forms. The emphasis on narrative representation, symbolic gestures, and moral instruction contributed significantly to the visual and performative vocabulary of later classical traditions. Thus, the Mauryan cultural landscape stands as the bridge between earlier folk ritual traditions and the emerging canon of formalized art, theatre, and dance, eventually influencing the aesthetic foundation that would shape the classical art of India. Under the reign of Emperor Ashoka, Mauryan culture entered a phase of a remarkable artistic expansion and ideological refinement. Ashoka's commitment to the principles of dharma transformed the cultural landscape by promoting an ethic of compassion, non-violence, and social harmony, which became deeply embedded in the artistic expression of the period. His patronage led to the construction of stupas, rock-cut caves, monastic complexes, and the famous polished sandstone pillars that serve both as moral proclamations and aesthetic landmarks. Although these structures primarily communicated Buddhist teaching and imperial authority, their visual vocabulary often incorporated graceful rhythms, symbolic gestures, and fluid bodily forms that closely resemble elements of performance. The recurring motif of animals in motion, dancers in gentle tribhanga like postures, and attendants positioned in suggestive narrative sequences reveal an underlying dialogue between monumental art and the performing arts. The synergy indicates that even as Mauryan art was largely didactic and symbolic, it preserved and subtly celebrated the kinetic sensibility of dance and the expressive framework of early theatrical traditions. Now let's study about the performing arts at Mauryan world. The performing art during the Mauryan period formed an integral part of both courtly life and broader social culture. Within the royal courts, dancers, musicians, drummers, and entertainers played essential roles in ceremonial events, diplomatic receptions, and festive celebrations, reflecting a vibrant and sophisticated performance traditions. The visual arts of the Mauryan age, especially the iconic depiction of Yakshis, offer crucial evidence of the period aesthetic sensibilities. These figures, carved with the extraordinary grace, display early forms of the Tribhanga posture marked by three elegant body bends. Their softly swaying hip, raised arms, and rhythmic stance convey an unmistakable sense of movement, suggesting that sculptures were deeply attuned to the dynamism of the human body. Through these representations, we see how early artisans did not merely imitate physical form but internalized the expressive potential of dance and gestures. The interplay between sculpture and embodied performance reveals that aesthetic seeds from which the codified vocabulary of the Natya and Nritta would eventually grow, linking the Mauryan artistic imagination to the later classical tradition shaped by texts like the Natyashastra. While the Mauryas laid the ideological and structural foundation for monumental art, it was the Shungas who expanded this visual vocabulary through more narrative, animated, and folk infused sculptural forms. Thus, we now move to the Shunga period, a crucial bridge toward narrative relief art and performative imagery. After the decline of the Mauryas, the Shunga dynasty emerged in North India, ushering in a period marked by heightened artistic energy and greater emphasis on folk, narrative, and performative representations. The Shungas continued stupas patronage but transformed its artistic style, moving away from the polished surfaces of Mauryan stone to richly carved lively reliefs. Now let's study about the major artistic contributions of the Shunga period. The very first one is Bharhut and Sanchi reliefs. These monuments exhibit detailed scenes of community gatherings, processions, musicians, dancers, and lively dramatic enactments. The Toranas, which is the gateway arcs of these stupas, depict women dancing, musical ensemble, drummers, and performers in dynamic action. If we study about the folk elements of this period, unlike modern elegance, Shunga art incorporates strong folk aesthetics, simpler proportions, animated gestures, and narrative storytelling, mirroring the performing tradition that grew outside elite court spaces. If we look into the performative sensibility, many relief panels show proto-theatrical scenes including storytelling moments that resemble dramatized Jatka narrative. The imagery reflects how performance in movement, gestures, and spatial arrangement influence the visual art during this time. With the Shunga period, narrative sculpture and performative motifs became central to artistic expression. In the next stage of our study, we will study how these developments matured further through the Satavahana, Kushana, and Gupta periods phases that shaped classical iconography, temple culture, and codified aesthetic theory, including the consolidation of the Natyashastra in its early forms. After examining the Maurya and Shunga periods, when imperial patronage stupa sculpture and early aesthetic codification shaped artistic production, we now move to a phase where political power became more regional and diverse. The decline of Magadhan dominance led to the rise of several influential dynasties such as the Kushans, Satavahanas, Shakas, and IndoGreeks. This shift from a centralized empire to multiple regional states created a new cultural zones, each contributing its own stylistic vocabulary, religious expressions, and performance traditions. This period, thus, marks a vibrant chapter where artistic interaction, trade networks, and religious mobility enrich India's visual and performing arts. If we look into the cultural and artistic, the expansion across region. So, in the post-Mauryan era, it witnessed flourishing contact between the India and Central Asia through expanded trade routes, especially under the Kushans. This cultural synthesis produced some of the most celebrated art traditions in the subcontinent, most notably the Gandhara school, which shows Greco-Roman influences in drapery, anatomical modeling, and expressive gestures, and the Mathura school, known for its indigenous stylistic strength, vigorous forms, and symbolic iconography. Simultaneously, the Satavahanas in Deccan supported the development of the Amravati style, marked by dynamic bodily movement, swirling drapery lines, and narrative depth in relief sculptures. These regional schools, though distinct, shared a common enthusiasm for representing movement, gestures, and emotion, making them crucial to understanding the evolution of performance imagery in ancient India. Having understood the sculptural and visual transformations of this period, we now examine how these artistic innovations reflected and shaped the performing arts, especially music, dance, and ritual performance practices. So, if we look into the music, the period is notable for the flourishing of Gandharva music, an early form of structured melodic tradition associated with celestial musicians but also increasingly practiced in courtly and religious settings. Sculptures from Mathura, Amravati, and Gandhara depict musicians playing flutes, lutes, drums, and cymbals, suggesting a vibrant musical culture woven into religious and social life. Buddhist establishments, in particular, encouraged the use of hymns, chants, and musical recitations in devotional settings, resulting in a rich sound culture across monasteries and urban centers. If we look into the dance tradition, dance continued to gain prominence, particularly within temple rituals in emerging Proto Shaiva and Vaishnava traditions. Figurines, relief, sculptures, and decorative panels show dancers in expressive postures, rhythmic foot positions, and graceful arm movements, indicating both ritual and entertainment purposes. At Amravati and Nagarjunakonda, narrative panels portray dancers participating in religious celebrations, processions, and community gatherings, revealing the deep integration of dance into everyday and spiritual life. Now, if we look into the folk, masks, and Yaksha ritual traditions, this period also strengthened the Lokadharmi, which is the folk based or the realistic performance traditions. The widespread presence of Yaksha and Yakshi figures, masked guardian deities, and nature spirit imagery points to a strong ritual theatrical culture across regions. Masks found in archaeological context and nature spirit iconography in relief suggest early roots of later Indian folk theatre forms, where performers embodied divine and divine or ancestral beings through elaborate masks, rhythmic movement, and dramatic enactment. Having explored the diverse cultural and performative expression under the post-Mauryan regional dynasties, we now move toward the next major phase of Indian history. We will study the Kushan, Gupta, and early classical age, where artistic refinement, temple architecture, and the full blossoming of classical aesthetic philosophy transform India's visual and performing art landscape. We studied how post-Mauryan regional dynasties such as the Kushans, Satavahanas, Shakas, and IndoGreeks shaped India's cultural landscape through diverse artistic styles and expanding trade networks. These centuries of interaction and experimentation laid the groundwork for a new era of consolidation. With the rise of the Guptas, India entered what historians often call the classical Golden Age, a period marked by extraordinary refinement, standardization, and philosophical depth across the arts. The Gupta period did not emerge in isolation. Rather, it harmonized earlier rich regional traditions into a sophisticated cultural system that greatly influenced later Indian performing arts. If we study about the cultural features and artistic environment in Gupta period, the Gupta state, though not as territorial vast as the Mauryan Empire, provided stable governance and sustained patronage to scholars, poets, sculptors, and performers. This stability created an environment where artistic theory and practice could flourish in tandem. One of the most important markers of this era is the standardization of iconography, where images of deities such as Vishnu, Shiva, and Devi acquired clear aesthetic norms, graceful proportions, serene expressions, and symbolic ornaments. Similarly, temple architecture began developing recognizable forms, including structured garbhagrahas, shikhara, and ornate doorways. These architectural traditions provided formal spaces where ritual, music, and dance could be performed, thereby strengthening their cultural presence. Having understood the broader aesthetic landscape, we will now look at how the performing arts, especially dance, drama, and music, developed into mature classical forms under Gupta patronage. With this, I conclude my lecture and we will continue with the Gupta period in next. Thank you.